The morning she told me started like every other one, quiet but heavy, the kind of quiet that already feels tired before the day even begins, and I remember standing at the sink with my hands in warm, soapy water, scrubbing dried spaghetti sauce off plates from the night before, thinking about nothing in particular and everything all at once, when she walked in smiling in that way people smile when they think they're bringing good news. Waving a pregnancy test like it was some kind of prize, and she didn't even pause, didn't even sit down, just said it casually, almost playfully, that she was pregnant again. And I swear the word again echoed in my head louder than anything else, because it wasn't shock that hit me first, it was exhaustion, the kind that sinks into your bones and doesn't ask permission, ha ha ha. Imagine hearing life-changing news while you're elbow-deep in dishwater, and before I could even form a response she laughed and said something like, "Guess you're not going anywhere," and then added, almost as an afterthought, "You're basically their second mom anyway," and that was it. That was the moment something inside me cracked just a little, not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet snap like a thread pulled too tight for too long. And I looked down at my hands, wrinkled from the water, still holding a plate that slipped and clinked softly against the sink, and she didn't notice she was already scrolling on her phone, probably looking at cribs we couldn't afford or baby names she liked, while my mind started racing through numbers and years and memories. 4 kids already, 4 little lives I had helped raise. 4 childhoods I had stitched together with early mornings and late nights, 3 bedrooms, 1 house that never felt empty, and me, always me, filling in the gaps, and the worst part wasn't the pregnancy, no, babies happen, life happens. What hurt was the assumption, the way it was said like a fact already decided, like my life was just an extension of hers, like I was furniture that came with the house, and as I stood there, the water going cold around my wrists, I thought about how 8 years ago this was supposed to be temporary, just a few weeks, just until they got back on their feet, haha, isn't that always how it starts? Just for now, and now here I was, 8 years later. With mornings that began before sunrise and nights that never really ended, with school lunches packed just the way each child liked, one with no peanut butter, one with extra snacks, one with a little note scribbled in the corner. And wrists that ached from lifting sleepy bodies and folding endless laundry, and bills I quietly paid because someone had to, and I watched her walk away humming, already planning a future that apparently included me without ever asking. And I felt invisible in a house I kept running, and I don't know if you've ever had that feeling, that strange mix of love and resentment, where you care so deeply it hurts but you're also so tired you could cry. All because I had given everything without keeping track, thinking love didn't need receipts, and yet there I was, standing alone in the kitchen, realizing no one had ever asked if I was okay with doing it again. And as the kids started stirring in the other rooms, footsteps and voices filling the house, I wiped my hands on a towel and leaned against the counter for just a second longer than usual, breathing in, breathing out. Telling myself not to react, not yet, because reacting would mean admitting something had changed, and I wasn't ready to say it out loud, but deep down, somewhere beneath the routine and the responsibility, a thought began to form. Quiet but persistent, what if this time I didn't just accept it? What if this time I chose myself, and that thought scared me more than the pregnancy ever could, because choosing myself meant disrupting everything, and for a woman like me, who had spent years being needed, the idea of stepping back felt almost wrong, like abandoning a role I'd been playing for so long I'd forgotten when it started. And yet, as the day went on, as I moved through the familiar motions of breakfast and backpacks and reminders to brush teeth, that thought stayed with me, tapping gently, refusing to go away, and somewhere in the middle of all that noise and responsibility, I realized something important, something uncomfortable, something that might sound familiar to you too. Sometimes the moment that breaks you isn't loud at all, it's casual, tossed into your day like it doesn't matter. And if this story already feels close to your heart, if you've ever felt taken for granted or quietly assigned a role you never agreed to, then stay with me, and maybe, just maybe, consider subscribing. Because these stories aren't just stories, they're mirrors, and this one was only just beginning, because that morning didn't just announce another baby, it quietly announced the end of the version of me that always said yes. Even when it cost me everything, and as I rinsed the last plate and set it on the rack, I didn't know how or when, but I knew one thing for sure, this time, I wouldn't disappear into the background again. The morning she told me started like every other one, quiet but heavy, the kind of quiet that already feels tired before the day even begins, and I remember standing at the sink with my hands in warm, soapy water, scrubbing dried spaghetti sauce off plates from the night before, thinking about nothing in particular and everything all at once, when she walked in smiling in that way people smile when they think they're bringing good news. Waving a pregnancy test like it was some kind of prize, and she didn't even pause, didn't even sit down, just said it casually, almost playfully, that she was pregnant again. And I swear the word again echoed in my head louder than anything else, because it wasn't shock that hit me first, it was exhaustion, the kind that sinks into your bones and doesn't ask permission, ha ha ha. Imagine hearing life-changing news while you're elbow-deep in dishwater, and before I could even form a response she laughed and said something like, "Guess you're not going anywhere," and then added, almost as an afterthought, "You're basically their second mom anyway," and that was it. That was the moment something inside me cracked just a little, not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet snap like a thread pulled too tight for too long. And I looked down at my hands, wrinkled from the water, still holding a plate that slipped and clinked softly against the sink. And she didn't notice, she was already scrolling on her phone. Probably looking at cribs we couldn't afford or baby names she liked, while my mind started racing through numbers and years and memories. 4 kids already, 4 little lives I had helped raise. 4 childhoods I had stitched together with early mornings and late nights, 3 bedrooms, 1 house that never felt empty, and me, always me, filling in the gaps. And the worst part wasn't the pregnancy, no, babies happen, life happens. What hurt was the assumption, the way it was said like a fact already decided, like my life was just an extension of hers, like I was furniture that came with the house. And as I stood there, the water going cold around my wrists, I thought about how 8 years ago this was supposed to be temporary, just a few weeks, just until they got back on their feet, haha, isn't that always how it starts? Just for now, and now here I was, 8 years later. With mornings that began before sunrise and nights that never really ended, with school lunches packed just the way each child liked, one with no peanut butter, one with extra snacks, one with a little note scribbled in the corner. And wrists that ached from lifting sleepy bodies and folding endless laundry, and bills I quietly paid because someone had to, and I watched her walk away humming, already planning a future that apparently included me without ever asking. And I felt invisible in a house I kept running, and I don't know if you've ever had that feeling, that strange mix of love and resentment, where you care so deeply it hurts but you're also so tired you could cry. All because I had given everything without keeping track, thinking love didn't need receipts, and yet there I was, standing alone in the kitchen, realizing no one had ever asked if I was okay with doing it again. And as the kids started stirring in the other rooms, footsteps and voices filling the house, I wiped my hands on a towel and leaned against the counter for just a second longer than usual, breathing in, breathing out. Telling myself not to react, not yet, because reacting would mean admitting something had changed, and I wasn't ready to say it out loud, but deep down, somewhere beneath the routine and the responsibility, a thought began to form. Quiet but persistent, what if this time I didn't just accept it? What if this time I chose myself? And that thought scared me more than the pregnancy ever could, because choosing myself meant disrupting everything, and for a woman like me, who had spent years being needed, the idea of stepping back felt almost wrong, like abandoning a role I'd been playing for so long I'd forgotten when it started. And yet, as the day went on, as I moved through the familiar motions of breakfast and backpacks and reminders to brush teeth, that thought stayed with me, tapping gently, refusing to go away, and somewhere in the middle of all that noise and responsibility, I realized something important, something uncomfortable, something that might sound familiar to you too. Sometimes the moment that breaks you isn't loud at all. It's casual, tossed into your day like it doesn't matter. And if this story already feels close to your heart, if you've ever felt taken for granted or quietly assigned a role you never agreed to, then stay with me and maybe, just maybe, consider subscribing. Because these stories aren't just stories, they're mirrors, and this one was only just beginning, because that morning didn't just announce another baby, it quietly announced the end of the version of me that always said yes. Even when it cost me everything, and as I rinsed the last plate and set it on the rack, I didn't know how or when, but I knew one thing for sure, this time I wouldn't disappear into the background again. After that phone call, I tried to shake it off, haha, told myself I'd misheard or misunderstood, because surely no one could live inside a routine built by someone else and call it managing alone, right? But the words followed me through the rest of the day like a bad echo, bouncing around while I folded laundry, while I wiped fingerprints off the walls, while I reheated leftovers and stretched them just enough to feed everyone. And every small task suddenly felt heavier, like it carried proof I didn't know how to present. And that night, when the house finally quieted down, when the kids were asleep and the TV murmured in the background for no one in particular, I sat on the edge of the couch with my phone in my hand, not scrolling, not texting, just staring at the screen. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to think the thought all the way through, what if I moved out, not dramatically? Not angrily, just left, and the idea scared me so much my stomach tightened, because leaving meant admitting that the life I'd built there wasn't really mine. And the next morning, while my son tied his shoes by the door, I heard myself say it out loud before I could stop it. I think I need to move out, and he didn't look up, didn't pause, just said, "Okay, do what you need to do, just don't leave us stuck." And something about the way he said us instead of we hurt more than I expected, because us meant them, the household, the system, not me and him, not a conversation, just logistics, and I nodded like I understood. Like that was reasonable, even though inside something thin and fragile finally snapped, because I had raised that boy, held him through fevers, stayed up through heartbreaks, celebrated every small win. And now I was just a potential inconvenience, and I spent the rest of that day moving on autopilot, feeding kids, answering questions, doing what I always did until that afternoon when I opened my banking app. Not because I planned to, just out of habit, the way you check the weather without thinking, and the number on the screen made my breath catch, sigh, because a large chunk of money was gone. Money I knew hadn't gone to groceries or bills or anything we needed, and I scrolled slowly, my finger trembling just a little, hoping I'd misunderstood, hoping it was a mistake, but there it was. A charge from a boutique baby store across town, the kind of place with soft lighting and prices that assume someone else is paying, and I stood up so fast my chair scraped the floor, walked straight to the trash, and found the receipt folded neatly on top, like it wasn't even hiding, a designer crib, matching bedding, a monogram fee, ha. Imagine monogramming something you didn't pay for. And I stared at that piece of paper until the words blurred, then opened the fridge, half a carton of milk, ketchup, leftovers I'd already stretched too thin, no fruit, no fresh vegetables, nothing planned. And when the kids asked what was for dinner, I poured cereal into bowls and smiled like it was normal, because it always was, and later. When she came downstairs rubbing her stomach and talking about how expensive babies are these days, I nodded and folded laundry, because what do you even say when you realize someone feels entitled to your sacrifice? And that's when it hit me, not like anger, not like betrayal, but like clarity. That money wasn't an accident, it wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a choice made with the full confidence that I would absorb the impact like I always had. And something inside me went very still, very calm, because once you see a pattern clearly, it loses its power to confuse you. And that evening, after everyone went to bed, I opened a note on my phone and started typing, not groceries. Not reminders, but facts, dates, receipts, things I'd never bothered to track before because I thought love was enough, and maybe it should be, but love without respect turns into obligation, and obligation turns into resentment. And I didn't want to wake up one day hating the people I'd given my life to, so I wrote quietly, methodically, like someone preparing for a future she hadn't fully accepted yet, and the next morning, Saturday, I woke up to crying, loud, desperate, the kind that pulls you out of sleep before your eyes are even open, and I was halfway down the hall before I realized what was happening, the toddler standing outside his parents' locked door. Fists balled, face red, crying like the world had ended, and I knocked once, then again, louder, no answer, just muffled movement and silence, and I picked him up because of course I did. Because love doesn't shut off just because clarity turns on, and I fed him, changed him, soothed him, and texted my son that his child had been crying outside the door, and the reply came fast, "We're exhausted. Can you take care of it?" And that was it, no apology, no acknowledgement, just an order, and I stared at that message for a long moment, feeling something inside me finally give way, not in a dramatic collapse, but in a quiet release. Because in that moment I understood something important. I wasn't failing them by wanting to leave, I was failing myself by staying silent. And when she finally came downstairs hours later and asked if I'd given the baby a bath, like I'd overstepped instead of stepped in, I realized this house didn't see me as a person with limits. It saw me as a resource, and resources are used until they're empty, and as I washed the dishes slowly, letting the warm water steady my hands, I knew that whatever came next wouldn't be easy, but it would be necessary, because the moment you're treated like you're replaceable, you either disappear quietly or you choose yourself loudly. And very soon, I would be forced to do one or the other. After that weekend, something in me changed, not loudly, not in a way anyone else could see, but inside it was like a switch had flipped, and suddenly I was watching everything from a small distance. Like I was standing just outside my own life, noticing details I had ignored for years, the way no one ever checked the fridge before asking what was for dinner, the way the trash magically emptied itself, the way laundry reappeared folded without anyone wondering how, and I started noticing how tired I felt even after sleeping, how my shoulders ached, how my patience had thinned, and one afternoon, while I was sorting through mail at the kitchen table, I realized something that made my chest tighten. All the important accounts were in my name, utilities, groceries, even some subscriptions I didn't use. Because it had been easier that way, easier for them, and I laughed softly to myself, not because it was funny, but because it was absurd, ha. Here I was, the woman they claimed didn't do much, quietly holding the house together with auto-pay and routines, and I wondered how long it would take for everything to fall apart if I stopped, and that thought scared me, because it meant they didn't see me as a person. They saw me as infrastructure, something that just existed and functioned without complaint, and I didn't confront anyone, not yet, because confrontation requires energy, and all my energy was going toward observing, toward preparing. toward understanding just how deep this went, and that night, while folding clothes in my room, I started separating things in my head: what was mine, what wasn't, what I could live without, what I couldn't. And I surprised myself by how little I actually needed, because when you've spent years giving everything away, you forget how simple your own needs are. And the next few days moved on like nothing had changed: school drop-offs, homework questions, spilled juice, tiny arguments, bedtime routines, and through it all, I kept thinking about that receipt, about the confidence it took to spend someone else's money without asking, and I realized something uncomfortable. They weren't cruel, not intentionally, they were comfortable, and comfort can make people careless in ways cruelty never could. And then one evening, while I was making pasta because it was cheap and filling, she mentioned casually how stressful it was to be pregnant again, how much pressure she was under, how tired she felt, and I nodded, stirred the pot, listened, because I did understand: pregnancy is hard, motherhood is hard. But something inside me whispered, so is being the invisible safety net, and for the first time I didn't rush to reassure her, didn't say it would all be okay, and she noticed, not enough to ask, but enough to glance at me like something was off. And later that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I thought about how many times I had swallowed my own discomfort to keep the peace. How many times I'd told myself it wasn't worth making a fuss, and I wondered when exactly I'd learned that my feelings were less important than everyone else's convenience. Because no one teaches you that lesson directly. It creeps in slowly, disguised as love, as duty, as sacrifice, and the next morning I started doing something small but important. I began keeping copies, screenshots, notes, not out of spite, but out of self-protection. Because something in my gut told me that when I finally spoke up, the story wouldn't be told the way I remembered it, and I needed proof of my reality. And that same day, while the kids were at school and the house was quiet, I overheard her on the phone again, laughing this time, talking about how lucky they were to have help, how nice it was that someone was always around, and she didn't say my name, just someone. And that's when I realized something else. I wasn't even a person in the story they told about their life. I was a background character, a blur, and that hurt more than anger ever could, because anger fades but erasure lingers. And when my son came home that evening, tired from work, complaining about how much pressure he was under, how expensive everything was getting, I listened, nodded, comforted him like I always had, and then, very calmly, I asked a simple question. Do you think any of this would work without me? And he paused just for a second, then shrugged and said, we'd figure it out. And maybe he meant it kindly, maybe he didn't mean anything at all. But that shrug told me everything I needed to know, because when someone assumes you'll always be there, they stop imagining what life would look like without you. And that night, after everyone went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table alone. The house finally quiet, and I opened my phone and typed a sentence that felt heavy and freeing all at once: find a place. And I stared at those words for a long time, heart pounding, because typing them made everything real. And I didn't know how or when or what it would cost emotionally, but I knew I couldn't unsee what I'd seen, couldn't go back to pretending this was just helping, because help has an end and this didn't. And as I turned off the lights and walked down the hall, stepping over toys that weren't mine, I felt a strange mix of fear and relief, because for the first time in years, I wasn't planning for everyone else's future. I was quietly, carefully planning my own, and that decision, once made, has a way of pulling everything else toward it, whether you're ready or not. Saturday morning arrived without asking, the kind of morning that starts before your eyes are fully open, with a sound that pulls you out of sleep like a rope around your chest, a soft whimper at first, then louder, then desperate. And before I even understood what was happening, my feet were already on the floor, moving down the hall on instinct alone, because that's what years of caregiving does to you. It trains your body before your mind, and there he was, standing outside his parents' bedroom door, fists balled, face red, crying like the world had ended, still in his pajamas, no diaper change, no breakfast, no one else in sight, and the door behind him was closed, locked. Of course it was, and I stood there for a second longer than usual, listening, hoping someone inside would respond, hoping I wouldn't have to step in again, sigh, and I knocked once, twice, louder the second time. And nothing happened except a brief shuffle and then silence, like the room itself was pretending not to hear, and I bent down, scooped him up, felt his little body cling to mine like he was afraid I might disappear too. And his crying softened into hiccups as I rocked him, whispering nonsense the way you do when love fills the gaps words can't reach, and I carried him to the living room, made oatmeal with the last banana sliced thin, changed his diaper, cleaned his face all before the sun was fully up, and while he ate, still sniffling, I sent a message I'd sent too many times before, telling my son his child had been crying outside the door, and the reply came almost instantly. We're exhausted. Can you take care of it? And I stared at those words, reading them again and again, waiting for something softer to appear, a thank you, a sorry, anything, ha ha ha, but there it was, plain and final, an order, not a request. And something inside me went very quiet, not angry, not dramatic, just done, because exhaustion is not a permission slip to abandon responsibility, and love should never feel like an obligation someone else delegates. And by the time she finally came downstairs hours later, hair wrapped in a towel, stretching like she'd had the rest she deserved, the toddler was already asleep on the couch, thumb in his mouth, cheeks still blotchy from crying. And she glanced at him, then at me, and asked, "You gave him a bath?" Like I'd crossed a line instead of stepped into a vacuum, and I said calmly, "No, I fed him and changed him. He was crying at your door for a while," and she nodded, no apology, just, "Well, he's fine now," like that settled something, and I turned back to the sink, washing dishes slowly, letting the warm water steady my hands. Because if I stopped moving, I might say something I couldn't take back, and behind me the house woke up fully, cartoons blaring, cereal spilling, little voices calling my name, not hers, never hers, and in that noise. In that ordinary chaos, I felt the weight of every unspoken expectation settle on my shoulders, and I realized something that made my chest ache. This wasn't help anymore, it was dependence without gratitude. And if you've ever been the one everyone relies on but no one checks on, if you've ever felt like the default setting in someone else's life, then you know how lonely that realization can be. And if this story is hitting a little too close to home, if you're quietly nodding along thinking, "Yeah, I know that feeling," then stay with me, maybe even subscribe if you want to hear more stories like this, stories about boundaries, about quiet strength, about choosing yourself without burning everything down, because sometimes hearing someone else say it out loud gives you permission to think it too. And later that day, after the house finally settled, after homework and dinner and bedtime routines that still fell to me, I sat at the kitchen table alone and wrote something new in my phone, not a list of tasks, not reminders for tomorrow, just a sentence: "Ask for space, not help." And that sentence felt strange and powerful all at once, because for years I had been asking to be needed, not realizing I deserved to be respected, and a few days later, on a Tuesday afternoon, with the house unusually quiet, I said it out loud. "I'll be moving out in 30 days, my voice steady, calm, not angry, and I explained I'd finish the school month, leave meal plans, make the transition easy because that's who I was. And they stared at me like I'd spoken a language they didn't understand. No one asked where I was going, no one offered help. They just nodded, stunned, silent, like the idea of me leaving had never been real to them. And maybe it hadn't, because when someone has always been there, people forget they can choose not to be. And as I walked back to my room that night, closing the door softly behind me, I felt something shift again. A mix of fear and relief, because the decision was no longer just a thought, it was spoken, and once words leave your mouth, they start moving on their own, pulling consequences behind them. And I didn't know then how quickly things would escalate, how ugly it could get when comfort is threatened, but I did know one thing: the version of me who rushed down the hall without thinking was slowly being replaced by someone who paused, observed, and chose, and that change, quiet as it was already making some people very uncomfortable, and the next thing they did to try to stop me would prove just how necessary that change had been. The days after I said it out loud felt strangely normal, almost eerie in how little changed on the surface, and that's what surprised me the most, haha, because you'd expect shouting or arguing or at least questions. But instead there was just silence, the kind that pretends nothing happened, and I went on with my routines because habits don't disappear just because decisions are made, so I still woke up early, still packed lunches, still drove the kids to school, still answered the same questions I'd answered 1,000 times before, and yet inside, everything felt different, like I was walking through a house I was already leaving. Noticing details with a kind of sharp clarity: the crack in the wall near the stairs, the loose handle on the pantry door, the way my shoes always sat by the back entrance because I was the one running in and out. And I started doing small things quietly, nothing dramatic, nothing anyone would notice, just sorting through drawers late at night, separating what was mine from what I'd absorbed into the household over the years, folding my clothes tighter than usual, stacking books I hadn't opened in years, slipping items into a box that slid neatly under the bed, and there was something oddly calming about it, sigh, like reclaiming pieces of myself one at a time. And no one commented, no one asked, because acknowledging it would have meant admitting that I was serious, and pretending kept everyone comfortable, and I realized how powerful denial can be when it protects convenience. And then, 2 days later, on a morning that started like any other, with cereal bowls and scattered backpacks and the hum of routine, there was a knock at the door, firm and unfamiliar, and my first thought was that it must be a delivery. But when I opened it, 2 uniformed officers stood on the porch, serious but polite, and one of them said, "Ma'am, we received a call about a possible child endangerment situation," and my heart skipped, not out of fear, but out of disbelief, because for a brief second I thought, oh, so this is how far they're willing to go, and I stepped aside and invited them in, my voice calm, hands steady, because when you've lived with quiet anxiety for years, A moment like that doesn't break you, it focuses you, and they looked around the living room, the clean floors, the folded laundry on the couch, the baby monitor on the table, the smell of soup simmering from earlier prep. And I could tell they were already confused, and I sat them at the dining table and said very evenly, "Let me explain," and I pulled out a folder I'd prepared without fully knowing why: receipts, bank statements, screenshots, printed messages, proof of years that no one had ever questioned until now. And I explained that I wasn't the legal guardian, that I wasn't paid, that I'd been living there to help family, that I paid the bills, bought groceries, handled childcare not because I was obligated but because I cared, and then I showed them the messages asking me to step in, the schedules, the records, and finally, a photo from the day before, the toddler at breakfast. Face messy with jelly, smiling, healthy, safe, and I said quietly, "If there's neglect here, it isn't coming from me." And the older officer leaned back, exhaled slowly, nodded once, and thanked me for my time, and just like that, they left. No accusations, no further questions, the door closing behind them with a soft click, and I stood there for a long moment staring at the empty space where they'd been, feeling something settle deep in my chest, not triumph, not anger, but confirmation, because calling the police wasn't about concern, it was about control, about fear of losing the system that had worked so well for them, and when my son came home later and avoided my eyes. When his wife moved through the house with stiff politeness, I understood something important. They weren't angry because I was wrong. They were angry because I was no longer compliant, and life in the house continued as if nothing had happened. Cartoons, meals, bedtime routines, but the air felt thicker, quieter, like everyone was waiting for something to snap. And that night, after everyone went to bed, I slid another box under my bed, sealed and labeled in my own handwriting. And I wrote my name on it in small letters, a simple act that made my throat tighten. Because it reminded me that I still belonged somewhere, even if that somewhere was still undefined. And over the next few days, I kept packing quietly, one drawer at a time, one shelf at a time, my life slowly shrinking out of the house while everything else stayed exactly the same. And then one evening, while I was sorting through old papers, my grandson stood in the doorway longer than usual, watching me without speaking, and when I looked up he asked softly, "Are you moving?" And I told him, "Not yet, I'm just organizing." And he nodded like he understood more than I'd said, then handed me a folded piece of paper, a drawing from school, uneven lines and bright colors, me in the middle holding hands with the kids, and I swallowed hard. Because sometimes children see the truth long before adults are ready to admit it, and after he left I sat there holding that drawing, realizing that leaving wouldn't just be about me, it would ripple outward, and that scared me. But staying would have done the same, just more quietly, and a few mornings later, with my list running through my head: milk, bread, apples, I grabbed my reusable bags and keys and stepped out the front door, telling myself I'd be quick. Telling myself this was just another errand, not knowing as the door closed behind me that it was the last time it would ever open for me in the same way again, because sometimes endings don't announce themselves. They disguise themselves as ordinary moments, and you don't realize what you've lost or gained until you try to come back. When I came back from the store, the bags felt heavier than usual, not just with groceries but with a strange sense of unease I couldn't shake, like my body knew something my mind hadn't caught up to yet. And I remember juggling apples and a rotisserie chicken, thinking I'd gone a little overboard because one of the kids had asked for cinnamon rolls all week, and I'd finally given in. Ha ha ha, small joys, right? And I walked up the steps, reached for my key, slid it into the lock, and it wouldn't turn, not even a little. And at first I thought I was just tired, that I hadn't lined it up properly, so I tried again, slower this time, pressing harder. But the metal didn't budge, and my stomach dropped because it was the same door, the same lock, the same key I'd used 1,000 times before, and I looked up at the house number just to be sure. Like maybe exhaustion had finally scrambled my brain, but no, everything was exactly where it should be except me, and I rang the bell, waited, rang it again, and after a long moment the door opened just a crack, not welcoming. Not surprised, just enough for her face to appear, and she looked at the bags in my arms, then at my face, and instead of stepping aside, she stepped out and pulled the door closed behind her, and that's when I saw them, my boxes. Stacked neatly on the porch, sealed, labeled, my handwriting on the side like evidence of a life already sorted, and one of them was dented at the corner, barely holding together. And something in my chest tightened so hard I thought I might cry right there. But I didn't, because she crossed her arms and said flatly, "If you've already decided to leave, it's better if you go now. No discussion, no goodbye. No thank you," just a sentence delivered like a verdict, and the groceries sagged in my grip, a tomato rolling out and hitting the concrete, splitting open, and she didn't even glance at it, didn't glance at me either. Like I was already gone, and I set the bags down slowly, straightened my shoulders, nodded once, because sometimes dignity is all you have left, and I started loading the boxes into my car in silence, one by one. The quiet broken only by the sound of cardboard sliding and my own breathing, and I noticed the porch light was off even though the sun hadn't set yet, like the house was already shutting me out. And by the time I sat in the driver's seat, hands shaking on the wheel, the rotisserie chicken sat alone in the passenger seat, still warm, and I laughed softly through the tightness in my throat. Because of course the thing I carried out of that house was food for people who weren't there anymore, and I took one last look at the front door, half expecting it to open, half hoping someone would stop me, but it stayed closed, solid. Final, and I turned the key and drove, not knowing exactly where I was going, just knowing I couldn't stay, and the road blurred as I headed toward the only place I had access to. A small spare unit above a garage that a friend had once mentioned, and the drive felt unreal, like I was watching myself from somewhere above, wondering how an ordinary errand had turned into exile. And when I finally parked and stepped into that quiet, empty space, boxes stacked around me, I felt something unexpected settle over me, not panic, not regret, but relief, because the silence didn't feel lonely, it felt earned. And that night, sitting on the floor eating cold chicken with my hands, I realized something that made me exhale for the first time in years. They had tried to scare me back into my place, to lock me out of the life I'd been living for them. But instead, they'd unlocked something else entirely, and I knew then that what came next wouldn't be easy, because people who lose control don't give up quietly, and the way they'd already crossed lines told me this wasn't over. Not by a long shot, because when comfort is threatened, some people don't apologize, they escalate, and I was about to learn just how far they were willing to go to avoid taking responsibility. The first night there felt unreal, like I'd stepped into someone else's life by mistake, the space small and quiet, just one room with a narrow kitchenette and a bathroom with cracked tiles, nothing fancy, nothing warm yet, but it was clean. And more importantly, it was mine, and I set my boxes down slowly, one by one, listening to the echo of my own footsteps. Ha ha ha, it was strange how loud silence could be when you weren't used to it. And I laughed softly when I realized I didn't even have a microwave for the cinnamon rolls, so I ate one cold, sitting on the floor, crumbs on my shirt, and somehow it tasted like freedom. And that night I unrolled a thin sleeping mat near the window, opened it just enough to let cool air drift in, and for the first time in years I slept without listening for footsteps or crying, without waiting for a call of my name. And when morning came, it came gently, sunlight across the floor, no alarms, no urgency, and I lay there for a moment just breathing, sigh, because I could, and I made eggs and toast in that tiny kitchen, ate alone. Washed one plate and set it aside without a pile waiting behind it, and something about that simple act made my eyes sting, because it reminded me how little I actually needed to feel okay. And a few days later, I walked 3 blocks to a children's center I'd noticed before, a help wanted sign taped crookedly inside the door, and I filled out the application, chatted with the director about schedules and routines. And for the first time in a long while, someone listened to me without interrupting, without assuming, and I walked home with a paper coffee cup feeling lighter than I had in years, and life began to settle into a quiet rhythm. Mornings that belonged to me, evenings without guilt, and yet, even in that peace there was an ache, because leaving doesn't erase love, it just changes how you carry it. And some nights I sat by the window watching parking lot lights flicker on, thinking about the kids, wondering what they'd been told, wondering if they thought I'd abandoned them, and that thought hurt. But I reminded myself I hadn't left to punish anyone. I'd left to survive, to breathe, to remember who I was when no one needed something from me, and weeks passed, then months, and slowly the fear faded, replaced by something steadier. Confidence, and I learned how to exist without apologizing, how to rest without earning it, and then one afternoon, while organizing papers at my small table, I found an old envelope tucked into a book. Savings I'd started years ago without any particular plan, just a habit of putting something aside whenever I could, and as I held it, an idea formed, not out of anger, not out of spite, but out of love that hadn't turned bitter. And I realized that walking away didn't mean cutting ties to my values. It meant choosing how I showed up on my own terms, and 6 months after the day the door wouldn't open, I stood across the street from a familiar school. Sunlight warm on my shoulders, 5 envelopes in my hands, thick and neatly sealed, names written carefully on the front, and my heart didn't race like I expected it to, because this wasn't about confrontation, it was about closure. And as the bell rang and children poured out, laughing and shouting, I waited until the crowd thinned, then walked inside and left the envelopes at the front desk with a simple explanation, their family, and no one stopped me. No one questioned me, and as I walked back out into the afternoon, something inside me finally settled, because I knew that whatever story they told about me, I had told the truth with my actions. And the final chapter of this wasn't going to be loud or dramatic, it was going to be quiet, intentional, and complete, and what those envelopes held would speak long after I was gone. 6 months is a strange amount of time, long enough for habits to fade but short enough for memories to stay sharp, and by then my days had found a rhythm that felt almost gentle, mornings with light instead of alarms. Evenings that didn't demand anything from me, and I learned how to move through the world without explaining myself, without checking my phone every few minutes, without bracing for the next need. Hahaha, it sounds small, but it felt huge. And I started noticing parts of myself I'd forgotten, the way I liked my coffee, the songs I hummed when no one was listening, the comfort of sitting still without guilt. And yet, even in that quiet, the kids never left my mind. Because love doesn't turn off just because the circumstances change, it just softens around the edges, and some nights I'd catch myself setting aside an extra apple out of habit, or listening for a sound that never came. And I'd smile sadly and remind myself that missing someone doesn't mean you made the wrong choice. It just means you cared, and caring doesn't disappear overnight, and one afternoon, while cleaning out an old box. I found photos I'd tucked away years ago, snapshots of birthday candles, missing teeth, messy kitchens, moments where I was always just off to the side or behind the camera, and I sat on the floor flipping through them, realizing how much of their childhood I'd been present for without ever being centered, and something in me decided then that I didn't want to be erased from their story, not with bitterness, not with confrontation, but with intention. And that's when I began writing letters, slowly, carefully, one at a time, not the kind that accuse or explain, but the kind that remember, telling them about the small things, the day someone learned to ride a bike, the night someone couldn't sleep and crawled into my bed, the afternoons spent doing homework at the kitchen table, and I chose my words gently because children don't need the weight of adult mistakes. They need reassurance that they were loved deeply and without conditions, and I included something else too, something practical, something hopeful, a savings certificate in each envelope. Money I'd been setting aside for years without knowing exactly why, college, trade school, books a start, because I wanted their future to feel lighter than my past had, and the fifth envelope was different, thinner, with no name written yet. Just a letter inside that began with "Dear Grandchild," because even though I'd never met that baby, even though everything around their arrival had hurt me, that child still deserved a beginning untouched by resentment. And writing that letter was harder than I expected, my hands trembling as I wrote about hope and possibility, about choosing kindness even when it's difficult, and when I finished sealing the envelopes, I didn't cry, I felt calm. Like I'd placed something important where it belonged, and the day I went to the school, I didn't tell anyone, didn't announce it, didn't prepare a speech. I just stood across the street watching children spill out, backpacks bouncing. Voices loud and bright, and I waited until the rush passed, until my heart felt steady, because I didn't want to do this from a place of sadness or guilt, I wanted to do it from clarity. And when I handed the envelopes to the woman at the desk, I simply said they were for their family, nothing more, and she nodded, accepting them like it was the most ordinary thing in the world, and maybe it was. Because love doesn't need a stage, and as I walked away, I didn't look back, not because I didn't care, but because I didn't need to. The chapter was closed, and in the weeks that followed, I thought less about the house. Less about the door that wouldn't open, less about the way I'd been pushed out, and more about the life I was building quietly, steadily, one choice at a time, and I understood something then that I wish I'd known earlier. Leaving doesn't always mean walking away from people. Sometimes it means walking toward yourself, and that realization didn't erase the past, but it reframed it, turning years of silent sacrifice into proof of resilience. And as I sat by my window one evening, lights flickering on outside, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time, peace, not the kind that comes from everything being perfect, but the kind that comes from knowing you honored yourself without losing your humanity, and I knew the final thing I needed to say, the final truth of this story, was still waiting, because what happened next wouldn't be loud or dramatic. It wouldn't involve raised voices or apologies, it would be quieter than all of that, and sometimes the quiet endings are the ones that echo the longest. I didn't tell anyone I was coming back into their world that day. I didn't call ahead or announce myself, because I wasn't there to reopen wounds or demand explanations. I was there to finish something. And as I walked away from the school with lighter hands and a steadier heart, I understood that closure doesn't always look like a conversation. Sometimes it looks like choosing not to carry bitterness any further, and in the weeks that followed, my life continued to grow in small, meaningful ways, more hours at work, familiar faces, routines that belonged to me, and the apartment that once felt empty now felt settled, like it had learned my name, hahaha. And I began to sleep deeply, without bracing myself for the next demand, without replaying old arguments in my head, and every now and then I wondered what they said about me, whether my name came up at dinner, whether the kids asked questions, but I stopped myself from chasing those thoughts, because healing doesn't mean getting answers, it means deciding which questions no longer deserve your energy. Sigh, and I reminded myself that I hadn't left to teach anyone a lesson, I'd left to save myself, and that distinction mattered because it kept my heart soft, and one evening, sitting by the window with a cup of tea cooling in my hands, I thought about how my name might never appear in their version of events, how I might be reduced to a sentence or erased entirely, and strangely, that didn't hurt the way it once would have, because I knew the truth of who I'd been, who I'd shown up as even when it cost me, and truth doesn't need witnesses to exist, and I imagined a future moment, years from now, when those envelopes would be opened, when small hands would unfold letters written with care, when they'd read words that reminded them they were loved without conditions, supported without strings, and maybe they'd wonder why I left, or maybe they'd already know, but either way. They'd understand that love can be strong and still choose distance, that boundaries aren't abandonment, they're self-respect, and that thought brought me a quiet sense of peace, all because I had done what I could without destroying myself in the process. And if there's one thing I hope stays with you after hearing this, it's this: giving endlessly doesn't make you noble if it empties you completely, and choosing yourself doesn't make you selfish if it allows you to keep your kindness intact. And if this story moved you, if you saw yourself in these moments, in the silence, in the exhaustion, in the quiet decision to walk away with dignity, then I hope you'll stay with this channel, maybe even subscribe. Because there are more stories like this, stories about ordinary people finding the courage to stop disappearing, and as for me, I didn't go back, I didn't knock on that door again. Because some chapters end not with an apology or a reunion, but with acceptance, and that ending, quiet and uncelebrated, was enough, because I finally understood something I wish I'd known all along. My worth was never tied to how much I gave, and walking away didn't make me smaller. It finally allowed me to stand tall, and somewhere, one day, when those letters are read and those savings are used, my presence will be felt not as a burden, but as proof that love can exist without sacrifice turning into suffering, and that is the ending I chose, not loud, not bitter, just honest, and sometimes honesty is the most powerful closure of all.